Welcome to the Patriotic Pulpit. Today I want to talk about what I call Zionism forcing God's hand. I've had many questions regarding commenting upon the Middle East, what's taking place regarding Israel and Hamas, Israel and the Palestinians. And so I want to give today some background to it, thinking about it broadly from the perspective of history, from the perspective of politics, from the perspective of the Bible. And I call this lesson specifically Zionism Forcing God's Hand. I use that title, borrowing it from a reporter who's died many years ago. Her name is Grace Halsell, and she writes many fabulous books on this particular topic. And one of her books, she called it Forcing God's Hand, speaking about the Israel occupation of the land of Israel and how that came about politically and historically. So, forcing God's hand. And so that's what I'm calling this lesson. There are several disclaimers I would like to make before we begin. Number one, I'm going to use the word Christian in a very broad sense. I believe that the word Christian, as is used in the New Testament, refers specifically to those who have believed the gospel, repented of their sins, been baptized in water for the forgiveness of them. Many people, and then by the way, that's from Acts chapter 2, verse 38, Mark 16 and verse 16, but many people who name the name of Christ, who claim the name Christian, are not truly, in the New Testament sense, Christians. So I'm using the word Christian in a very broad sense. Number two, I'm not commenting directly in this particular lesson on the recent attacks by Hamas. The recent attacks, that is a year ago, October 7th, by Hamas, horrific attacks against Israel, but I'm setting all that aside right now and giving some background to what is going on. And then number three, I want to give the background dispassionately. That is simply, let's look at the history of it. Let's look at what the politics are. Let's look at what the Bible teaches on it. I'll do that very briefly. But many people are so vastly mistaken regarding Israel in the place of God's plan. So Zionism forcing God's hand. To begin with, let's think about the term Zionism and what is included in Zionism when I speak about Zionism and what is not included. And I'm going to define it by telling a story. And this comes, Grace Halsell talks about this in one of her books, the book called Forcing God's Hand. This is a CBS 60 Minutes program that was aired in October 2002. So here is how the program went, and it does define what Zionism is for us and sets it up, sets the table for us. So the narrator said, what's the number one item on the Christian right? Abortion, school prayer, and today, of course, we would say homosexuality, but he added, no, believe it or not, what is most important to a lot of conservative Christians is the Jewish state, Israel, its size, its strength, its survival. Why? And then he said, Bob Simon, Bob Simon's the reporter. He said, Bob Simon reports. So several things come out. Number one, the government, our government, they want to be pro-Israel. American Christian Zionists say they're now a more important source of support for Israel, this is still Bob Simon reporting, than American Jews of the traditional Jewish lobby. It's my belief that the Bible Belt in America is Israel's only safety belt right now, says Jerry Falwell. They quoted Falwell, the late Jerry Falwell. There's 70 million of us, and if there's one thing that brings us together quickly, it's whenever we begin to detect our government becoming a little anti-Israel. So number one, the government must be pro-Israel. Bob Simon continues, it includes also the return of Jews to their homeland. What propels them, Simon asks? Why do they love Israel so much? The return of the Jews to their ancient homeland is seen by evangelicals as a precondition for the second coming of Christ. Therefore, when the Jewish state was created in 1948, they saw it as a sign. Israel's conquest of the West Bank in 1967 deepened their excitement, heightened their anticipation. And today's war between Jews and Arabs was also prophesied, they say, and they've seen it all before on the pages of the Bible. This, incidentally, is what he called forcing God's hand. The plot Bob Simon still reporting, he says, but the plot is ripped from the pages of the Bible, and he's commenting on the Left Behind series of books and movies. It all winds up here in Israel, according to the book of Revelation, in the final battle in the northern Israel called Armageddon. It will follow 7 years of tribulation, during which the earth will be shaken by disasters. The blood will rise as high as horses' bridles here in Armageddon before Christ triumphs to begin his 1,000-year rule. So let's think about all of these things. This, number one, it is to say that the government should be pro-Israel. He quoted Jerry Falwell to that end. Number two, it involved the return of the Jews to their homeland. And number three, the plot, they say, is taken out of the book of Revelation, or out of the Bible. But just to back up just a moment. By the way, just saying this right up front, all of that regarding the Bible, that is completely false. The Bible simply does not teach any of this, not even a shred of it, not a portion of it. But it involves, number one, a literalistic hermeneutic, that is, interpretation in a literalistic fashion. A futuristic reading of prophecy is the foundation upon which all of the tenets are based. And this is what they claim. And as we're going to see, that is inconsistent with, number one, themselves, and number two, it is inconsistent, or it ignores what Jesus and his apostles, or how they interpreted Old Testament prophecies. So it's inconsistent that a literalistic interpretation of Revelation or the Old Testament text, it is inconsistent with themselves, and it ignores how Jesus and the apostles actually prophesied and applied the text of the Bible. So it involves, number one, a literalistic hermeneutic. Number two, it is founded upon the belief that the Jews remain today God's chosen people, and they're to remain separate from the church. That, of course, is a false belief. The Bible does not teach that, but this is one of the groundwork beliefs of the system, that Jews remain God's chosen people. They tell us that God has two peoples, number one, the Jews, and number two, the church. Now, the consequence of this is very simple. Israel has a status above the church. Israel will replace the church. The church is simply an interruption in God's plan. It was God's intention to bless Israel as a physical nation only. The Christians are not God's chosen people today. All of that flows very naturally from the idea that the Jews remain God's chosen people today. That, of course, the Bible simply does not teach. But this necessarily involves that God's original people had been the Jews. God intended to establish David's royal line forever, but most of the Jews rejected the Messiah, which caused him to change his plans abruptly. So God temporarily set Israel aside, suspended prophetic time, and formed a new people, the church. That is the premillennial or the dispensational system. All of it, of course, is not Bible. Regardless of what people such as David, Jeremiah teach, this is not Bible. Number three, it involves the final restoration of the Jews to Palestine. It is based once again, that is Zionism, based once again on a literalistic, selective reading from the Old Testament prophets. The texts of the Old Testament themselves, such as used by Zionists, were fulfilled in the returns that occurred under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. That would be in 536, 457, 444 BC. All of the Old Testament texts to which Zionists point us to in the Old Testament, that is, as somehow going to be fulfilled in the future, have already been fulfilled in the return of the Jews from captivity, in Zerubbabel's return, 536 BC. I said 586 a moment ago. 536 BC, 457 BC, that would be Ezra, and then finally Nehemiah, 444 BC. Furthermore, New Testament writers apply restoration passages to both believing Jews and Gentiles in the church. Number four, it involves the land of Israel remains a Jewish possession. This is what Zionism holds, that the greater Israel, extending from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates, is the Jewish inheritance forever, and it is theirs on an unconditional basis. This ignores, friends, that the promises given to Abraham and to the Israelites later were all conditional in their nature. And we will see that in this series of lessons. Number 5, it involves that Jerusalem or Zion lies at the heart of Christian Zionism. The city is seen as the eternal, undivided, exclusive Jewish capital. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the conquering of all Jerusalem in 1967, they think are portions of God's plan. Nothing in the Bible, however, supports this, not one syllable. Number 6, according to Zionism, the temple must be rebuilt. The sacrifices must be reinstituted. This, they say, tell us, the Antichrist must destroy before Jesus returns. It's interesting, isn't it? The Bible doesn't refer to one individual as the Antichrist, even though that is popular parlance and popular doctrine. But the belief is that the Antichrist must destroy Jerusalem, or rather must return before Jesus returns, and must destroy a certain amount of the earth. That's the most controversial portion of Zionism to many churchgoers, but it is absolutely demanded by the foregoing premises. The New Testament, however, is emphatic that after the death of Christ, the temple, the priestly caste, and the sacrificial system became obsolete, and the perpetuation of these things is apostate. And it involves, number 7, that the immediate future is pessimistic. According to Zionism, the immediate future, doesn't matter if Donald Trump has been elected or not, is pessimistic. For virtually all Zionists, the immediate future is pessimistic. The Battle of Armageddon will, they claim, lead to the death of virtually 2/3 of all Jewish people before Christ returns to save the remnant. Christ will judge the world based upon how they have treated Israel, not individually, but how they have treated Israel. All of this is non-biblical. This plank has profound consequences, however, for international diplomacy. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, whom I admired, but Ronald Reagan was a Zionist. George Bush, all of them were in this camp. But this final confrontation, as they portray it, between Satan and God, they tell us, will take place in our day. That tells us that the immediate future is pessimistic. Most Christians, they tell us, however, will be plucked up to heaven before the battle starts. That is what they call the rapture. The rapture, however, not taught in the Bible. Christians view it, or they will view all of these things from the bleachers in heaven. That's according to the rapture theory. Then it involves what is called the tribulation period, 7 years of war, finishing off in the valley of Armageddon. Most Jews will be exterminated, and finally, many of them will become believers. All of that, of course, is not taught in the Bible. Revelation will talk about that in a future lesson. It involves also the support for Israel. Should be, by American standards, we should support Israel because we have to have a landing base for Jesus Christ. They give total, unquestioned support to Israel. Jesus is going to land in Israel, so they make a cult of the land. Jesus will begin his reign there. It is ours to support Israel. So the late Jerry Falwell and many others depict Christ as a 5-star general astride a horse, leading all the armies of the world, armed with their nuclear warheads, slaying billions of unbelievers. And in the meantime, God has 2 plans, one for Christians and one for the Jews. The earthly elect are the Jews. The heavenly elect are the Christians. All of this is a grand theory that is spun in the imagination of Zionists. It is not biblical. So let's go now to a little bit more specific definition of Zionism. Zionism, therefore, from the foregoing material, can be defined as the national movement for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and the resumption of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. So Mark Bruzonsky worked for many Jewish Zionist organizations, and he tells us that the Jews say that at the end of the exile, that is, they claim their land, given in the Old Testament, Genesis 12, still belongs to them. It's a nationalistic movement. British historian Arnold Toynbee defines Zionism as the worship of a false god. Toynbee is exactly right. An idolatrous religion. And many Arabs define Zionism as a form of racist colonization of their homeland. This is from Mark Bruzonsky again. You can get his material by reading Grace Halsell. This is secondary quotes. Mark Bruzonsky tells us, I term Zionism a political, expansionist, colonial-type movement that led to the creation of Israel. I term the Zionist as one who accepts the rationale of Israel's actions regardless of how wrong and how dangerous they may be. Are people today in the Christian world, are they expansionist? Indeed they are. The late Jerry Falwell frequently urged European Jews to go to Israel, claim Arab lands from the Nile River to the Euphrates. What? Now, what would happen if we had a president who said we have no borders and we're inviting people in the third world countries from South America, Central America, and from other foreign countries whose languages we do not understand and whose culture we do not appreciate, to come in here and claim land? Oh, yeah, we've had that. We've had that with Joe Biden. That's exactly what we've had. But that's what Jerry Falwell was claiming, and that's what he urged European Jews to do. Go to Israel and claim the Arab land. The conclusion, it's politics. It's all about the land and the co-claimants to the land. Indigenous Palestinians who lived there for 2,000 years and the Jews who started arriving in large numbers after World War II. What about all of this? Well, we're going to have clashes. The Palestinians have lived there for almost about 1,500 years. They've lived there in Palestine. But Zionists said, go over there and claim the land. Now, Zionism breaks into two different segments. Number one, they are the secular Zionists. Number two, they are the religious Zionists. Most of the Jews today fall into the secular Zionist camp, as far as I'm able to tell. Theodor Herzl, Theodor Herzl, by the way, writes one of the earliest books regarding this, about Zionism. I've read it very carefully. David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, these people were atheists, agnostics, not believers at all, just as today. Many American Jews today are atheists and agnostics. So here's a statement from Grace Halsell. Increasingly, American Jews have fallen victim to Zionism, a nationalistic movement that passes for many as a religion. That's exactly right. Never mind what Israel does, says Christian Zionist. God wants this to happen. That absolutely is the wrong direction. This has included invading Lebanon, which killed 100,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, most of them civilians, the bombing of sovereign nations such as Iraq, expelling Palestinian Christians and Muslims from the homes that they have had almost 2,000 years. But this is exactly what many Zionists, these are secular Zionists, want to do. But they're joined hand in hand with religious Zionists. But still the main concern, even though the religious Zionists, the main concern is political. Grace Halsell, in another book called Prophecy and Politics, 1986 book, explains, having gone on several tours with Jerry Falwell, that the concept of Zionism, at its core, is a revival of a militaristic view of the Messiah, a conqueror who expels Palestinians, including Christians. There are some Palestinians who are Christians, expels the Palestinians, even Christians, from their ancient homeland, where the cult of Israel is higher than the teachings of Christ. That is exactly what Zionism is about. Zionism is about politics. It makes no difference if there are people standing in the pulpits in the Baptist church or whatever pulpits they're standing in, Pentecostal churches, whatever. It's all about politics, and it's wrong-headed politics. It's a perpetuation, as one described it, of a mythology of Israel and prophecy that negates biblical Christianity. It is even allowed, as of 1986, for Christian Arab peoples to it was disallowed, I should say, as of 1986, for Christian Arab peoples to try to convert Jews. Now, just think about that for a moment. It was disallowed from 1986 forward for Christians Zionists to go over to Israel and convert Jews to Christ. Sadly, Ronald Reagan was a Zionist. Jimmy Carter was a Zionist. It affected their foreign policy. Many Reagan aides have stated that one reason he was not as concerned about deficits in America was because he was a Zionist. He was interested in Israel. How about the churches? The Southern Baptist Church has been completely taken over by Zionism as of 1989 with the election of Adrian Rogers as the president of the SBC. The SBC began in 1845, but Zionism has politics as its first priority. The State of Israel, the Assemblies of God, the Pentecostal, other charismatic churches, and also countless other Bible churches are basically politically oriented around Zionism. One of the leading intellectuals of an organization called Gush, I think it's Enyumim, Hanan Parat is his name, says that Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel and the dream of a priestly kingdom and being a holy nation are the preconditions for the world to become whole again. Unless these preconditions are met, there will be no peace. And you think about that for a moment. Unless America assists all of these things to take place as a landing place for the Messiah, supposedly, then there's not going to be peace in the world. Grace Halsell comments, all Zionists, whether it be Christians, Jews, most especially the leaders of the Jewish terrorist movement called the Gush Emunim, share Parat's mystical messianic views. They see the land of Israel as a moral absolute. Both Christian and Jewish Zionists insist that mysticism is a healthy part of the religious heritage. Rabbi Moshe Levinger, for example, a ringleader for the terrorists convicted of plotting to kill Palestinian mayors, destroy the Dome of the Rock, defines Zionism for himself and countless others. Now, here is a Jewish rabbi. Remember, we're thinking about how it's defined. He says, Zionism is mysticism. Zionism will wither away if you cut out from its mystical messianic roots. Zionism is a movement that does not think in rational terms, in terms of practical politics, international relations, world opinion, demography, social dynamics, but in terms of divine commandments. What matters only is God's promise to Abraham as recorded in the book of Genesis, end of quote. That was Rabbi Moshe Levinger. He's referring to Genesis chapter 12, the threefold promise to Abraham where he would be given, and his descendants, they would be made a great nation, they would be given land, and number three, there would be the seed through which all the nations would be blessed. So let's talk about the history of Zionism for just a few moments. The key is a return of the Jews to the Holy Land. This is a key, according to the Zionists, to end-time events as they see it in the Bible. Without a restored Israel, there can be no Antichrist, no tribulation, no Armageddon, no triumphant second coming of Christ. With a restored Israel, all of these things are not only possible, but guaranteed. All of this will hasten the return of Christ. And this is why Grace Halsell, in her book, calls it forcing God's hand. So we have to force the Jews to go back to Israel, and this will be forcing God's hand to set up this Jewish state, this messianic state. Theodor Herzl, generally known as the father of the political Zionism, that he did not really initiate or create, but what he recognized and said it was a movement to encourage Jews to Palestine. How about during the Reformation period? People began at that period, that would be about the 1400s, 1400s, 14th, 15th, 16th century. They began studying the Bible for themselves. And some of them came to the conclusion, wrong-headed though it may be, that the Jews should have a home, as in the Old Testament. Now we're getting down to where it comes into play today. Oliver Cromwell, for example, in the mid-17th centuries, Lord Protector of Puritan Commonwealth, declared that Jewish presence in Palestine would be a prelude to the second coming of Christ. In 1655, the German Protestant Paul Felgenhalver said the Jews would recognize Jesus as the Messiah at the second coming. Then in 1839, Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, urged the Jews to immigrate to Palestine. Once again, I want you to think about how we recognize that when the border of America has been erased by the Biden administration, encouraging people to come in here, flood in here, what would be and what has been our reaction? But that's exactly what these British Zionists were doing, and that is encouraging immigration into Palestinian lands. Lord Palmerston, British Foreign Secretary, desired to open a British consulate in Jerusalem. It was still a part at that time of the Ottoman Empire. Only 9,000 Jews lived there at the time. According to the established treaty rights, this protective status could only include foreign national Jews that moved there, not those that were born there. However, the British consul extended the protection to all Jews in Palestine. That is, Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary. And thus, for about 150 years, people who named the name of Christ, primarily in England and many in America, were the only advocates of Zionism. The leaders of Western imperialism gained no support from the Jews in their non-Jewish Zionism. Regina Sharif, in the non-Jewish Zionism, relates that even Christian Zionists were motivated primarily by political considerations. But now we come decades before World War I, where things began to take shape as to what has happened now. The Balfour Declaration. The European powers maneuvered to take advantage of the weakened Ottoman Empire. Britain, France, Russia had clashes over the Ottoman territory. The British purchased the Suez Canal in 1867. But Great Britain had an eye on Palestine, and rooted in political and religious ideas, they wanted to capture the country or the land of Palestine. Chaim Weizmann, who is Theodore Herzl's successor and leader of the International Zionist movement, taught chemistry at Manchester University in England and became friends with a British politician, including many British politicians, actually, including Arthur James Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary. Arthur James Balfour had been raised on much Hebraic Old Testament material. Balfour issued what was known as the Balfour Declaration, which promised to help the Jews in the reestablishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This was the closing days, remember, of World War I. November 2, 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration. 5 weeks later, now James Balfour, British Foreign Secretary, issues the declaration. We're going to take Israel for Jews. 5 weeks later, the British General Edmund Allenby marched into Jerusalem as a conqueror. The Balfour Declaration was analyzed by Barbara Tuchman, and she writes this: "They did it because they meant to take Palestine anyway for a strategic value, but they had to have a good moral cause or good moral case. The timing is important. When the Allenby army marched into Jerusalem, British flag, Union Jack, the British needed to dignify the moment. So not only in the eyes of the British people themselves, but all of the world, this was the purpose of the Balfour Declaration. It provided the effective moral attitude, the good case for British taking Palestine. It appealed to the imaginative side of the national character. In short, it allowed Britain to acquire the Holy Land with a good conscience." That is, end of quote, by Barbara Tuchman. So the Paris Peace Conference ended World War I, the League of Nations, and it turned the Balfour Declaration into international law. That was with the help of people such as our own socialist Woodrow Wilson. In 1922, they made British mandates for Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, French mandates for Syria and Lebanon. The League's mandate for the British authorized them to make a home for the Jewish people. This is the League of Nations. They encouraged immigration from foreign nations. But what about the Arab people who live there? What about the people who had been there and their families for 1,500 years? Once again, it is like the American government, led by, so far right now, can't wait for him to leave, Joe Biden, encouraging people to come over and crash our borders, flying them over the borders, encouraging all kinds of people from third world countries to come in here. And people don't like that. Well, the Arab people didn't like it either. The hypocrisy of all of this is seen in Wilson's 14 points and the Paris Peace Treaty itself, which emphasized the importance of self-determination. Self-determination. Imagine that. How about the Arabs? Do they have any self-determination? There were Arab people living there at the time. They had been there for over 1,000 years. What do we do with them? The British promised them independence if they assisted in their war against Turkey and the Central Powers. That's how Palestine was conquered by the British. And then we have the League of Nations, an international body like the United Nations, meddling in the foreign countries and setting up nations and setting up nation states. This is why our founders said, don't get entangled in the affairs overseas. But you see, we didn't pay attention to the founders. Woodrow Wilson hated the founders, as a matter of fact. When he would quote the Declaration of Independence, he would leave out our rights come from God. He would say our rights are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And he would not talk about God, not talk about God giving us those rights. Let's think about some of the issues and problems that have ensued since that time, and then we'll talk about a couple of passages very quickly. So the political issues are these. The British did not keep the promise of Arab independence. The Arabs rioted in 1920. They were concerned about immigration, just like Americans are concerned about immigration. Number two, the Zionists established terrorist organizations. I know that many people don't realize this, but this is the fact. This is a historical fact. Al-Husseini, the Mufti in Jerusalem, concerned the Haganah was the militia, paramilitary body over there, later formed what was called the Irgun, I-R-G-U-N, a violent resistance group. These are Zionists. Then we have the Wailing Wall. The Wailing Wall in 1928 was a divider that was erected. The Wailing Wall, of course, is part of Solomon's temple, but there was a divider that the Jews, that the League of Nations and the British people put in there, a divider to separate men and women at the Wailing Wall. The Wailing Wall is the foundation of Solomon's temple. That was it's on the western side of the Temple Mount. So they put up a divider between the men and women because that was not allowed by rules that men and women should intermingle. Arabs saw Israeli flags as a desecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so there were riots, there were troubles, people got involved in it, the British government got involved, the Arabs were upset. Then we have anti-Zionist riots in 1933, 1934. The British put together a commission under Lord William Peel called the Peel Commission. The final report in 1937 suggested the partitioning of Jerusalem. Then we have Abraham Stern. He's a Jew. He founded Lehi, a terrorist group for the Israelis, 1940. Lehi was called the Stern Gang, that his group was called the Stern Gang by the British. Many Zionist leaders were outraged at the violence and asked the British to eradicate the organization. But this is an Israeli organization of terrorism. Finally, because of all of these problems, the British gave up in 1947. After the United Nations had been created, Britain took down the Union Jack. They were turning it all over to the United Nations, and both sides began scrambling for control. Menachem Begin was the new leader of Irgun. Blew up a wing of King David Hotel in Jerusalem where the British were headquartered, killing 90 people and wounding 45. That's Menachem Begin's background. President Harry Truman got involved, demanded a visible Jewish state. Also, they were attacking Arab villages near Jerusalem. 250 civilians were killed. Arabs retaliated, attacking Jewish medical convoys on Mount Scopus, killing 77 doctors, patients, and students. November 1948. The United Nations decided in all of this mess. And how did it start? Well, we've described it to you. They created the State of Israel. Ben-Gurion had announced its birth in May. Now it was recognized by the United Nations, and it had U.S. backing. The religious Zionists in United States and Great Britain were supporting it. They were overjoyed. But one of the interesting things is the Bible doesn't teach any of it, and yet so many people said 1948 was a date that is to be remembered because that's the fulfillment of prophecy. What prophecy in the Bible establishes 1948? There's no prophecy of 1948 in the Bible at all. Matter of fact, the Bible does not speak about the state of Israel today at all. Then we have the Suez Crisis, 1956. The Six-Day War, 1967, Israel increased its territory, captured Jerusalem. It was seen by dispensationalists as hastening the day when the Lord returns, and almost uniformly predicting the second coming of Christ must be around the corner. I remember I think it was 1989 or 1988, 89. I went to a bookstore, a Christian bookstore. I've forgotten, this is right off the top of my head, and I've forgotten exactly the author of the book, but 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming in 1988. I thought, I guess it was probably 1986 or 87. This is all false prophecy, false predictions. Is based upon misunderstanding of the New Testament text. Let's consider some of the ethical issues that we need to consider. Number one, many people do not hold Jews in any way responsible, even though in history they have been, many of them, responsible. Very rarely did a premillennial writer hold any Jews responsible, even partly for the violence and trouble they had had in Palestine. Even in 1939, the partitioning plan was not acceptable to them. Palestine was to be given to the Jews, and that's exactly what they thought. They universally opposed the partition plan. All the world was troubled by the ethics of the land grabbing during the 1956 crisis, 1967. The dispensational writers uniformly said that they did not approve of Israel's methods, but it was necessary for God's plan. Now, that's interesting. Dispensational premillennialist writers would say we don't approve of the methods, but this is part of God's plan. Not at all is it part of God's plan. There's nothing in the Bible that predicts it. How about self-determination? Who had the legitimate claims to the land? The Arab people have been there for over 1,500 years. They are the majority by 3/4 of the population. Should 1/4 of it rule the nation? Shall it be ruled by democratic principles? If so, then 1/4. If so, then I guess 1/4 should not rule it if it's going to have democratic principles. You see, premillennialists, dispensational preachers do not grapple with this issue at all. What would residents of Texas do if a foreign power decided that we should relinquish our land to the descendants of the ancient Indians before the white settlers came, and then when they come here, then we're going to have repatriate them, bring them back to this property, and then they're going to run the country, or they're going to run the state. See, premillennial writers and thinkers don't even grapple with this issue. As a matter of fact, I'm going to say it this way: Christians have become hostages to the Jews and what the Jews do, and they pretend that God's plans are determined by what the Jews are doing. For example, Scofield's Bible. C.I. Scofield wrote the Scofield's Reference Bible. He was a dispensationalist. Scofield's dispensationalism not only holds Christ and Christianity hostage, but also God. It teaches that God cannot permit Christ to return until the Jews do their earthly part in God's scenario. And you can read that in his own materials in the Scofield Reference Bible. That's holding God hostage. How about the biblical issues? Are the Jews to be gathered in belief or unbelief? This is interesting. In the 19th century, almost all premillennialists said the Jews would be restored to the homeland after they had been converted to Christ. So conversion first, restored to homeland later. This would occur after the second coming, after they had survived the Great Tribulation. However, after the founding of Zionism, following Theodore Herzl and the secular Zionists, when a great number of Jews were heading to Palestine without faith in Christ, they changed their tune to say, well, they will return first and then they'll be converted later. Which is it? What does the Bible teach on it? They can't get its story straight on this at all. Others now, setting up a Palestinian state, tell us conversion is not even part of the prophetic program. That's interesting. They're not even interested in converting. But why is this important? Because many Zionist organizations supporting Israel from Protestant groups, but they are not at all interested in converting Jews to Christ. They accept the Israeli restrictions on passing out literature, on speaking about Christ. They're only interested in the Jewish state. As I told you at the beginning, it's all politics with them. It has nothing to do with converting people to Christ. That's only the flag it flies under. Zionists first, Christianity second. The issue is, however, what does prophecy say? They are totally confused on prophecy. Shall we work for the conversion of Jews to Christ? Or shall we work for the reestablishment of the state of Israel and then after that convert them? Or are we to work for the establishment of the state of Israel first, then convert? What? How's this to go? But the most important thing regarding the Bible is this. The Jews, as well as the Christian Zionists, they absolutely misunderstand the plain text of the New Testament that tells us that God's Jew is a Christian. There is no Jewish person by blood before God today. That is, God does not recognize as a chosen person or a chosen people Jews by blood. Blood has nothing to do with it. Romans chapter 9, verses 23 and following. What if God, willing to show his wrath, make his power known, endured with much long suffering, vessels of wrath fitted for destruction? He's speaking about the Jews, that he might make known the riches of his glory, according the riches of his glory, which afore prepared unto glory, even us whom he also called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. As he saith in Hosea, I will call that my people that was not my people, and her beloved that was not beloved. And in the place where it was said unto them, you are not my people, there shall they be called the sons of the living God. Paul is emphatic that God's Jew, so to speak, is the Christian. And God had put up with the Jewish nation so long, giving them so much leverage, so much time. And at the end, he tells us God's select person is the Christian. He might make known the riches of his glory. This is what he afore prepared unto glory. Make known the riches of his glory, not upon Jews only, but also the Gentiles. How does that happen? Anyone who comes into Christ. And so we are told in Romans chapter 2, verses 28 and 29, he is not a Jew who is one outwardly. Neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, whose circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. He is not a Jew who is one outwardly. Same thing in Colossians 3 and 11. There is no Jew today. In Ephesians chapter 2, the wall of partition, the law of Moses, was broken down. So I ask the question as we conclude. Why establish Old Testament worship? Why do premillennial dispensational teachers and preachers who are all over the radio, who are all over podcasts and on television, why do they want to reestablish Old Testament worship? Efforts to control all of Jerusalem have only one issue in mind, and that is to rebuild the temple. But rebuilding the temple means destroying the mosque. That will be war that follows. And reinstituting the Old Testament worship. Why build a temple unless you're going to rebuild or reinstitute Old Testament worship? But the New Testament teaches us that worship will not be in Jerusalem or in any locale at all. But worship today is in spirit and truth. Spiritual and according to the truth of God's Word. That's John 4, 21 through 24. Zionism is wrong-headed politically. Zionism is wrong-headed religiously.